The morning sun cast long shadows across the courtyard as Preston Locke approached Nia Brooks' apartment with two large men flanking him, their intimidating presence designed to terrorize. His expensive leather shoes clicked against the concrete with the rhythm of someone who believed the world owed him deference. Behind him, Gino Moretti and Dax Harlan moved like predators who had done this dance too many times before. Preston pulled out his phone with theatrical precision, holding it up to record as his voice boomed across the complex. "You've got exactly 10 minutes to get out," he announced, loud enough for every neighbor to hear through their morning routines. His face was flushed with the kind of entitlement that came from years of unchallenged power. "I don't care about your lease or your so-called rights." Mia opened her door slowly, her hand instinctively moving to shield 6-year-old Zoe behind her legs. The little girl's bright yellow t-shirt seemed to dim in the shadow of the three threatening figures, her wide eyes filled with the kind of fear no child should ever know. Mia's red blazer hung perfectly pressed, despite the early hour, her professional appearance a stark contrast to the chaos Preston intended to create. "This neighborhood was decent before your type moved in," Preston continued, stepping closer with the confidence of a man who had never faced real consequences. His voice dropped to a menacing whisper that somehow carried more threat than his shouting. "You can leave quietly, or we can make this very unpleasant for you and your kid. Your choice. But either way, you're gone today." The sound of Gino cracking his knuckles behind Preston echoed like small gunshots in the morning. Dax adjusted himself to block anything they may have planned for escape. Both men wore the expressions of people who enjoyed making other people suffer, and their very presence was meant to thwart thoughts of resistance. Nia's hand went to her jacket, where her federal credentials were housed, almost like a nervous reflex, as she took in the illegal acts. After documenting everything for 3 months, she was not expecting Preston to escalate things so quickly. In front of her daughter, her training kicked in, as she added it up: intimidation, harassment, illegal eviction attempt, and civil rights violation, all on Preston's recording device. "You think you can just stand there and ignore me?" Preston's voice rose again, spittle flying as his anger built. "I own this place. I decide who belongs here and who doesn't. And parasites like you definitely don't belong." The weight of her federal authority pressed against Nia's chest like a loaded weapon, waiting to be drawn. But her daughter's trembling hand, gripping her leg, reminded her that some battles required perfect timing. Preston Locke had just sealed his fate, but he would learn that lesson when she was ready to teach it. Welcome to Chains Broken, where we honor those who refuse to be silenced. If you believe courage deserves to be remembered, subscribe now and carry their legacy forward. 3 hours earlier, Preston Locke had sat in his mahogany-paneled office, reviewing what he called his problem tenant files. The morning light filtered through expensive blinds, casting shadows across photographs of properties he owned throughout the city. Each image represented not just real estate, but territory he controlled with an iron fist wrapped in legal paperwork. "The Brooks woman is perfect," he had told Gino over coffee, his voice carrying the satisfaction of a predator selecting prey. "Single mother, works some low-level job, probably can't afford a real lawyer. Classic Section 8 case that thinks she has rights." Preston had pulled out a manila folder thick with fabricated complaints and carefully worded lease violations. His strategy was always the same: create enough legal-sounding pressure to force unwanted tenants out before they could mount any real defense. The fact that his targets were predominantly Black and Latino wasn't coincidence. It was intentional market curation. "What about the kid?" Gino had asked, lighting his third cigarette of the morning. "Even better," Preston had replied with a cold smile. "Nothing motivates cooperation like a mother's fear for her child's stability. We show up with enough presence to make her understand this isn't a negotiation." What Preston didn't know was that his Section 8 case had been listening to every word through surveillance equipment that would have impressed most police departments. Nia Brooks sat in her apartment, federal-grade recording equipment carefully concealed throughout the space, documenting months of Preston's systematic discrimination against minority tenants. Her real office wasn't a small desk by her window. It was a federal facility, 30 miles away, where Agent Kai Lennox monitored her transmissions and coordinated with prosecutors, building a case that would reshape housing law enforcement. The shabby apartment was theater, and Nia Brooks was the lead actor in the most important performance of her career. As Preston's voice crackled through her earpiece detailing his illegal eviction strategy, Nia made careful notes in what appeared to be a child's coloring book. Each crayon mark was actually coded intelligence that would become federal evidence. Zoe sat beside her, unknowingly helping her mother document crimes by asking innocent questions that prompted longer, more incriminating responses from their targets. "Mama, why does that man always look angry when he sees us?" Zoe had asked that morning, her 6-year-old intuition picking up on Preston's obvious hostility. "Some people haven't learned how to see past the color of someone's skin, baby," Nia had replied, her voice gentle despite the rage building in her chest. "But that's their problem, not ours." Through her window, Nia watched Preston's black BMW pull into the complex parking lot. The car was pristine, detailed weekly at a shop that charged more than most of his tenants made in a month. Behind him came Gino's beat-up truck and Dax's motorcycle, the vehicles telling their own story about the hierarchy of Preston's operation. Her phone buzzed with a text from Agent Lennox, recording active, Federal Response Team, standing by. Your call on timing. Nia watched Zoe put her dolls in their safe circle, something the little girl did every morning. Nia's heart broke for this little girl who took so much care to create order in her tiny world, who was about to be subjected to an adult hatred on such a grand scale. Federal investigations are sacrificial in nature. Sometimes you have to endanger your own kid so thousands of kids can be safe from systemic abuse. Nia had taken this task on knowing what it would cost. But Zoe's trusting smile made the crushing weight of that error feel acute. As Preston walked through the courtyard, his steps echoed as he neared the trap he laid for himself through months of illegal conduct. Nia positioned her red blazers correctly, while making sure her credentials were placed in the optimum position when the time arrives. The morning sun rose higher and brought everything into focus. Within a matter of minutes, Preston Locke would learn that his so-called problem tenant was actually his worst nightmare, a federal agent with many months of evidence and the power to annihilate his whole empire. The investigation had begun 6 months earlier in a sterile FBI conference room, where dozens of housing discrimination cases covered every wall like a map of systematic injustice. Agent Kai Lennox had stood before the evidence boards, pointing to patterns that told a story of coordinated civil rights violations across multiple states. Preston Locke isn't just a slumlord, Lennox had explained to the assembled federal task force. He's part of a network that's been systematically displacing minority families to artificially inflate property values. We're talking about organized economic terrorism disguised as legitimate business practices. The FBI had been tracking Locke for 2 years, watching him move from city to city, buying low-income properties, and then using harassment, intimidation, and fabricated legal violations to force out minority tenants. Once the neighborhoods were cleaned up, he would sell to developers for massive profits, leaving displaced families to find housing in increasingly restricted markets. Nia had volunteered for the undercover assignment, despite having a 6-year-old daughter, knowing that her credentials as both a federal agent and a genuine single mother would make her the perfect infiltrator. The Bureau had created her cover identity carefully. Nia Brooks, recently divorced, working as a medical assistant, struggling to make ends meet while raising her daughter alone. Federal technicians outfitted her apartment in Preston's complex with such sophisticated recording equipment that it could allegedly hear conversations through walls. All surfaces had microphones ingrained in them. All rooms were under video surveillance from smoke detectors, electrical outlets, and picture frames. The FBI had made her home some facility for surveillance that Preston walked inside every time he visited the property. For a constant period of 3 months, Nia regularly recorded a range of behaviors. Preston's discrimination efforts were not impulsive and not conducted in the heat of the moment. Rather, they were thoroughly premeditated, well-organized and finely tuned to minimize any hint of federal attention, while maximizing the psychological harm to those who become victims of his discrimination. He would begin with small infractions. That noise complaints were never filed by real neighbors. Surprise inspections that discovered problems that had not existed the day before. And the rent increases that appeared only to hit minority tenants. When those tactics didn't work, he intensified his intimidation, bringing large men to routine property visits, making thinly veiled threats to call immigration and implying that the cops were in his pocket. Nia had recorded Preston coaching his accomplices on exactly how far they could push without crossing lines that would trigger immediate legal consequences. Never touch them directly. She had captured him saying, "Never use specific racial slurs on camera. Always have a paper trail that makes it look legitimate. The system is designed to protect property owners, so use the system." What made Preston's operation particularly insidious was how he had corrupted local officials to support his activities. Commissioner Victor Kane from the Housing Authority had been feeding Preston inside information about federal investigations, giving him advance warning whenever complaints were filed. Detective Theo Whitaker had been ensuring that police reports from Preston's properties were either buried or written to support Preston's version of events. The network extended beyond housing into banking, where loan officers would mysteriously find reasons to deny mortgages to minority families trying to buy in neighborhoods Preston wanted to control. It reached into city planning, where zoning changes would be approved or denied, based on demographic projections that everyone understood but no one discussed openly. Agent Lennox had called it institutional racism. With a business plan, and the FBI's investigation had revealed similar operations in 17 cities across 8 states. Preston Locke wasn't just a local criminal. He was a key player in a conspiracy that was reshaping American housing patterns through systematic civil rights violations. But proving conspiracy required evidence of coordination, and evidence required access. That's why Nia had spent 3 months living as bait in Preston's trap, letting him document his own crimes, while building a federal case that would dismantle his entire network. Her daughter Zoe had become an unwitting federal asset. Her innocent presence, making Preston and his associates comfortable enough to speak freely around what they assumed was just another struggling single mother. The little girl's trauma was collateral damage in a larger war against systematic injustice. A cost that federal prosecutors had calculated was worth paying to protect thousands of other families from similar abuse. Now, as Preston approached with his intimidation squad, Nia felt the weight of those 3 months of careful planning. Every recorded conversation, every documented violation, every piece of evidence was about to be tested against Preston's belief that his money and connections made him untouchable. Through her earpiece, Agent Lennox's voice provided final confirmation. Federal response team in position. Prosecutors standing by. Recording devices active. You are cleared to engage. Nia took a deep breath, feeling the federal badge against her chest like armor. Preston Locke was about to learn that his problem tenant was actually the most dangerous person he had ever encountered. A federal agent with evidence, authority, and absolutely nothing left to lose. Preston Locke's empire hadn't been built overnight. It was the product of 15 years of carefully cultivated relationships with every person who mattered in the city's power structure. His real office wasn't the mahogany-paneled space downtown, but the private dining room at Meridian Country Club, where deals were made over whiskey and handshakes between men who understood that money talked louder than laws. 3 weeks earlier, Preston had sat across from Commissioner Victor Kane in that same dining room, discussing what Kane euphemistically called demographic optimization strategies. The Housing Authority Commissioner was a thin man with nervous hands, who had learned early in his career that turning a blind eye to certain activities paid better than enforcing regulations. The Brooks woman is becoming a problem, Preston had said, sliding a manila envelope across the polished table. Inside were photographs of Nia, and Zoe, along with fabricated reports claiming lease violations, noise complaints, and suspicious activities. She's asking too many questions about tenant rights, encouraging others to file complaints. Kane had flipped through the documents with the practiced eye of someone who had legitimized far worse paperwork. "What do you need from me?" "Make sure any complaints she files get lost in bureaucracy," Preston had replied, lighting an expensive cigar. "If she contacts federal agencies, I want advance warning. And if she somehow gets a lawyer, make sure they understand the costs of fighting City Hall." The arrangement was simple. Kane would use his position at Housing Authority to shield Preston's operations while receiving monthly payments that tripled his government salary. In exchange, Preston would ensure that Kane's own real estate investments, properties bought with insider information about upcoming development projects, would increase in value as neighborhoods were systematically improved. But their network extended far beyond housing. Detective Theo Whitaker had been on Preston's payroll for 8 years, ensuring that police reports from Preston's properties always favored the landlord's version of events. When tenants called police for help, their complaints were filed as civil matters that required expensive lawyers to resolve. When Preston's associates engaged in intimidation, witnesses somehow forgot details or failed to appear for follow-up interviews. Judge Elias Ford at the local magistrate's court had been invaluable in processing eviction cases with minimal scrutiny. His courtroom operated on a schedule that prioritized property owners' time over tenants' rights to proper legal representation. Cases were heard and decided so quickly that most tenants never understood what had happened until sheriff's deputies arrived to remove their belongings. The banking connections were perhaps most crucial. Loan officers at 3 major institutions had been instructed to flag mortgage applications from minority families seeking to buy in specific neighborhoods. The denials were always for legitimate-sounding reasons: credit scores, debt-to-income ratios, employment verification issues, but the pattern was unmistakable to anyone tracking the data. Preston's operation had successfully gentrified 7 neighborhoods over the past decade, displacing over 3,000 minority families while generating $47 million in property value increases. The human cost was carefully hidden in statistics that could be explained away as market forces, economic development, and urban renewal. What Preston didn't know was that every name in his network had been identified by federal investigators. Every payment had been traced through banking records, and every conversation in that country club dining room had been recorded by FBI surveillance equipment, hidden in the antique light fixtures above their table. Agent Kai Lennox had been tracking the conspiracy for 18 months, building cases against each individual while mapping the connections that would prove organized criminal enterprise. Preston's mistake wasn't just discriminating against tenants. It was creating a criminal organization that systematically violated federal civil rights laws across multiple jurisdictions. The FBI had obtained warrants to monitor Preston's communications, bank accounts, and business meetings. Federal prosecutors were preparing RICO charges that would treat his housing discrimination network as organized crime, with penalties that could include decades in federal prison and forfeiture of every asset he had acquired through illegal activities. But building a RICO case required evidence of ongoing criminal conspiracy, which meant allowing Preston to continue victimizing families while federal agents gathered proof. Nia Brooks had volunteered to be the bait that would trigger Preston's most aggressive behavior, knowing that her daughter would witness whatever psychological damage Preston inflicted. The moral calculus was brutal, but necessary. Sacrifice one family's immediate well-being to protect thousands of families from systematic abuse. Federal investigations required federal sacrifices, and Nia had made peace with that cost when she accepted the undercover assignment. Now, as Preston approached her apartment with his intimidation squad, every federal agency involved in the case was watching through concealed cameras, recording devices, and satellite surveillance. The moment Preston crossed the line from harassment into criminal threat, federal response teams would move simultaneously across 8 cities to dismantle his entire network. Preston Locke believed he was forcing out another unwanted tenant. He had no idea he was walking into the center of the largest housing discrimination prosecution in federal law enforcement history. Zoe Brooks had never seen men look at her mother the way Preston's associates were looking now. At 6 years old, she couldn't articulate the difference between normal adult conversation and predatory threat assessment. But her body understood what her mind couldn't process. Her small hands began trembling as she pressed herself deeper behind Nia's legs, trying to disappear into the safety of her mother's red blazer. "Mama," she whispered, her voice barely audible above Preston's continued threats. "Why are those men angry at us?" Nia felt her daughter's fear, like a physical weight, pressing against her chest. 3 months of federal training had prepared her for confrontation, violence, and legal complexities, but nothing had prepared her for watching her own child experience the trauma of systematic racism in real time. Every protective instinct screamed at her to end the charade, show her credentials, and remove Zoe from immediate danger. But federal investigations demanded sacrifice. And sometimes that sacrifice came from the people agents were sworn to protect. Nia forced herself to maintain her cover even as she felt Zoe's breathing become rapid and shallow against her leg. The little girl was experiencing her first lesson in how quickly safety could disappear when the wrong people decided you didn't belong somewhere. "It's okay, baby," Nia whispered back, her hand moving to gently stroke Zoe's braids. "Mama's going to handle this." Preston stepped closer, emboldened by what he interpreted as submission. His phone continued recording as he gestured toward Zoe with obvious disdain. "That kid's going to learn real quick that life isn't fair for people like her," he said, his voice carrying the satisfaction of someone delivering what he considered valuable education. "Better she understands now that there are places she doesn't belong." Gino laughed, the sound harsh and metallic in the morning air. "Maybe we should call Child Protective Services," he suggested, knowing the threat would terrify any single mother. "Kid might be better off somewhere stable." The comment hit Nia like a physical blow. Using child welfare services as a weapon against minority families was a tactic she had documented in 17 separate cases during her investigation. Preston's network had corrupted social workers, teachers, and court officials who would file reports claiming neglect or abuse whenever parents became too difficult to intimidate through other means. Zoe's grip on Nia's leg tightened until her small fingernails pressed through the fabric. The 6-year-old didn't understand the specific threats being made, but she understood that powerful adults were discussing taking her away from her mother. Her breathing became audible, quick little gasps that sounded like a small animal trapped in a corner. "Please don't take me away," Zoe whispered, the words breaking Nia's heart into pieces that would never properly heal. "I'll be good. I won't make any noise." The plea was worse than any physical violence Preston could have inflicted. Zoe was already internalizing the message that her existence was conditional, that being black in certain spaces required constant apology and perfect behavior. At 6 years old, she was learning lessons about systematic racism that would shape her understanding of the world for the rest of her life. Nia felt her federal training warring with maternal fury. Her hand moved instinctively toward her jacket pocket, where her credentials waited, but she forced herself to stop. Revealing her identity now would protect Zoe from immediate trauma, but would destroy months of investigation that could protect thousands of other children from similar experiences. "Your 10 minutes are almost up," Preston announced, checking his expensive watch with theatrical precision. "I hope you're not planning to make this difficult." Dax stepped forward, cracking his knuckles again in a gesture designed to emphasize the physical consequences of non-compliance. His muscular frame cast a shadow that covered both Nia and Zoe, a visual representation of the power imbalance Preston's operation depended on. Through her earpiece, Agent Lennox's voice provided real-time support. "Federal response team ready for immediate deployment. Your call on timing. Child Protective Services standing by if needed." Nia looked down at her daughter, seeing her own fear reflected in eyes that should have been filled with childhood wonder instead of adult terror. Zoe's yellow t-shirt was damp with perspiration, her small body processing stress in ways that would require therapy to properly address. The weight of federal authority pressed against Nia's chest like armor she was desperate to deploy. 3 months of careful planning had led to this moment, where her dual identity as federal agent and protective mother would finally be tested. Preston Locke had pushed her daughter to the breaking point. And now he would learn what happened when someone threatened a federal agent's family. Nia's hand moved toward her credentials as her voice dropped to a tone that carried 3 years of FBI training and 15 years of federal law enforcement experience. "You need to step back from my daughter," she said quietly, her words carrying weight that made Dax unconsciously shift his position. Right now, Preston misinterpreted her controlled response as submission, not recognizing the difference between fear and tactical patience. His smile widened as he prepared to deliver what he assumed would be the final blow to another minority family's resistance. He had no idea that his 10-minute ultimatum was about to become the most expensive mistake of his criminal career. Mrs. Lila Voss had lived in apartment 3B for 17 years, long enough to witness Preston Locke's transformation from a relatively benign property manager into something that reminded her of men she had hoped never to encounter again. At 73, she had survived enough hatred to recognize it when it walked through her neighborhood wearing expensive clothes and carrying legal papers. The elderly woman stood at her kitchen window, her arthritic hands wrapped around a coffee mug that had gone cold 20 minutes earlier. She had been watching Preston's approach since his BMW pulled into the parking lot, recognizing the predatory swagger that meant another family was about to be destroyed. Her phone sat on the windowsill beside her, camera already activated and recording. Lila had documented 12 similar confrontations over the past 2 years, each one following the same pattern. Preston would arrive with his intimidation squad, target families with children, and escalate the situation until parents were too terrified to resist his illegal demands. She had tried reporting the incidents to local police, but Detective Theo Whitaker's reports always concluded that landlord-tenant disputes were civil matters requiring expensive legal solutions. What made this morning different was the quality of Preston's performance. His usual calculated aggression had been replaced by something more personal, more vicious. He was enjoying Zoe's fear in a way that reminded Lila of men who had once destroyed her own childhood in a different country, during a darker time. Through her phone's camera, she watched Preston gesture toward the 6-year-old with obvious contempt. She couldn't hear every word from her third-floor window, but she caught enough fragments to understand that he was using the child's presence as psychological warfare against the mother's resistance. Lila had been a refugee twice in her life, first as a child fleeing Eastern Europe, then as a young mother escaping domestic violence. She understood the particular helplessness of watching powerful people destroy your safety, while systems designed to protect you, instead, protected your oppressors. The woman in the red blazer standing between Preston and her daughter carried herself with a dignity that Lila recognized from her own mirror during the worst periods of her life. "Not again," Lila whispered to herself, adjusting her phone's position to capture the best possible angle. "Not in front of the baby." What Lila didn't know was that her recording was about to become crucial evidence in a federal prosecution, or that the FBI had been hoping for exactly this kind of independent documentation to corroborate their surveillance footage. Her arthritis-slowed fingers were creating legal history as she focused her camera on Preston's increasingly aggressive behavior. She watched Gino step closer to the mother and daughter, his posture clearly threatening despite maintaining enough distance to avoid obvious assault charges. Dax positioned himself to block potential escape routes, a tactic Lila had seen before but never with such military precision. These weren't random thugs. They were trained intimidators who understood exactly how far they could push without triggering immediate law enforcement response. The mother's composure was remarkable under the circumstances. Where Lila expected to see panic or submission, she saw something that looked almost like professional assessment. The woman was studying her attackers with the kind of focused attention that suggested she understood more about confrontation than Preston realized. When Preston made his comment about Child Protective Services, Lila's coffee mug slipped from her hands and shattered against the kitchen floor. She had heard that particular threat used against every minority family in the complex, watched children's faces crumble as they internalized the message that their families could be destroyed at any moment by forces beyond their control. But this time was different. The little girl's whispered plea for her mother not to let anyone take her away carried across the courtyard with heartbreaking clarity, and Lila watched the mother's entire demeanor shift in response. The controlled composure transformed into something harder, more dangerous. The woman's hand moved toward her jacket pocket with the kind of purposeful motion that suggested whatever she carried there would change everything. Lila adjusted her phone's zoom, intuiting that whatever happened next would be worth capturing. The morning light was perfect for recording, the audio clear enough to document every threat Preston made, every violation he committed. Her 17 years of watching injustice had finally positioned her to be a witness when justice fought back. Through her lens, she watched the mother issue her first direct warning, telling Preston to step back from her daughter. The words were quiet, but they carried an authority that made even Dax unconsciously shift his position. Lila had heard enough powerless women beg for mercy to recognize the difference between desperation and controlled warning. Preston, drunk on his own perceived authority, missed the change completely. He stepped closer instead of backing away, his smile widening as he prepared what he assumed would be his final assault on another family's resistance. Mrs. Lila Voss continued recording, her elderly hands steady despite her arthritis, documenting what she sensed would be the most important confrontation she had ever witnessed. The federal agents monitoring her phone's upload to social media would later call her footage the perfect angle for capturing Preston Locke's destruction. Preston Locke had built his career on understanding exactly where legal lines existed so he could dance as close to them as possible, without crossing into territory that would bring real consequences. But watching Nia Brooks maintain her composure despite his calculated intimidation had triggered something deeper than professional strategy. It had awakened a personal need to break her spirit completely. "I think you're confused about how this works," Preston said, stepping into Nia's personal space with the confidence of someone who had never faced real resistance. His expensive cologne couldn't mask the smell of entitlement and barely controlled violence that surrounded him like a toxic cloud. "You don't get to make demands. You don't get to negotiate. You get to do what you're told." Zoe's breathing had become rapid and shallow, her small body trembling against Nia's leg like a frightened animal. The 6-year-old's distress was visible to everyone in the courtyard, including Mrs. Lila Voss, who continued recording from her window above. Preston's deliberate use of the child's fear as psychological leverage crossed every moral line that separated aggressive business practices from criminal sadism. "Please," Nia said, her voice carrying what Preston interpreted as submission but was actually tactical de-escalation. "My daughter doesn't need to see this. Let me send her inside, and we can discuss whatever you need to discuss." Preston's laughter was harsh and metallic, designed to humiliate rather than express genuine amusement. "Your daughter needs to learn that actions have consequences. You've been asking questions about tenant rights, encouraging other residents to file complaints. That kind of behavior affects property values, and property values affect my business." Gino moved closer, positioning himself where his physical presence would create maximum intimidation. His leather jacket creaked as he crossed his arms, the sound sharp in the morning air. "Maybe we should search the apartment," he suggested, knowing the threat would terrify any parent. "Make sure there's nothing illegal going on that would require child services intervention." The comment was carefully calculated to exploit every minority parent's fear of having children removed by systems that consistently treated poverty as neglect and cultural differences as abuse. Preston's network had successfully destroyed 3 families using exactly this tactic, filing false reports that triggered investigations designed more to punish parents than protect children. Dax stepped forward, his muscular frame casting a shadow that covered both Nia and Zoe. "Lot of drug activity in this neighborhood," he said, his voice carrying the kind of threat that didn't require explicit language. "Easy for innocent people to get caught up in situations they can't control." Through her earpiece, Agent Kai Lennox's voice provided real-time legal analysis. Multiple federal violations confirmed. Conspiracy, intimidation, civil rights abuse. "You have full authority to engage." Nia felt the weight of her federal credentials against her chest, like a loaded weapon, begging to be drawn. 3 months of careful planning had led to this moment, where Preston's criminal organization would finally face the consequences of systematic civil rights violations. But her daughter's trembling body reminded her that federal justice came with personal costs that would follow Zoe for the rest of her childhood. "Step away from my child," Nia repeated, her voice dropping to a tone that carried 15 years of federal law enforcement training. "This is your final warning." Preston misread her controlled authority as desperate bluffing. His hand moved to his phone, adjusting the recording angle to better capture what he assumed would be a single mother's complete breakdown under pressure. "Your warning?" he laughed. "Lady, you're about to be homeless. Your kid's about to learn that life isn't fair for people like her, and there's nothing you can do about it." He reached toward Zoe, not to harm her, but to emphasize his power over every aspect of their lives. His fingers came within inches of the 6-year-old's braided hair as he continued his psychological assault. Maybe foster care would be better for her anyway. More stable environment, better influences. The moment Preston's hand moved toward her daughter, Nia Brooks ceased to exist. What remained was Special Agent Nia Brooks of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, with full federal authority to arrest anyone who threatened her family or violated civil rights under color of law. Her hand moved to her jacket with practiced precision, withdrawing leather credentials that caught the morning sunlight like a badge of divine intervention. The FBI shield gleamed as she held it at eye level, her voice carrying the full weight of federal authority. "FBI, you're under arrest." The words hit Preston like a physical blow, his expensive phone slipping from suddenly nerveless fingers to clatter against the concrete. His face went through a rapid progression of emotions: confusion, disbelief, comprehension, and finally, the terrible understanding that his problem tenant was actually his worst nightmare. Gino and Dax stepped backward. Instinctively, their intimidation training suddenly useless against federal authority they hadn't expected to encounter. The morning sunlight caught Nia's badge as she stepped forward, her professional demeanor replacing the vulnerable single mother persona she had maintained for 3 months. "Preston Locke, you are under arrest for conspiracy to violate civil rights under federal law, housing discrimination, criminal intimidation, and organized criminal enterprise," Nia continued, her voice carrying across the courtyard with the clarity of someone accustomed to making arrests that would reshape people's lives forever. Mrs. Lila Voss continued recording from her window, her arthritic hands steady as she documented the moment systematic racism collided with federal justice. The elderly woman had witnessed enough injustice in her 73 years to recognize the profound significance of watching predators become prey in real time. Preston's criminal empire, built over 15 years of carefully cultivated corruption, began crumbling the moment he realized his Section 8 parasite was actually a federal agent who had been documenting his crimes for months. The 10-minute ultimatum he had delivered with such confidence had become his confession to conspiracy charges that would destroy everything he had built. Federal response teams across 8 cities were already moving against his network, armed with evidence that Nia Brooks had gathered while pretending to be another victim of systematic discrimination. Justice had been patient, methodical, and absolutely devastating. Nia's FBI shield seemed to absorb the morning sunlight and reflect back Preston Locke's entire criminal empire at him in an impactful way. For 15 years he operated with impunity, believing that federal law enforcement was a world away and would never penetrate the corruption networks he carefully built up. It accentuated how wrong he'd been catastrophe-wise. Preston's phone was crushed on the ground where it had fallen, the black screen still showing the recording, which he would have used as proof of another successful intimidation. It was more than clear that his confession would also destroy everything he had worked hard to build. As he looked at Nia, terrorizing the single mother he was dealing with, didn't fit into Friedrich's mind. As hard as he tried to fathom it, it didn't fit. 3 months, Nia said, her voice carrying the professional satisfaction of someone completing a successful long-term operation. 3 months of listening to you explain your strategies, document your network, record your violations. Every conversation, every threat, every illegal act has been preserved for federal prosecution. The blood drained from Preston's face as he realized the scope of his exposure. Every meeting in his mahogany office, every conversation at Meridian Country Club, every coordination with corrupt officials had been monitored by federal surveillance. He hadn't detected. His mouth opened and closed without sound, like a fish drowning in air that had suddenly become unbreathable. Gino and Dax stepped farther back, their intimidation training suddenly irrelevant against an opponent they were neither equipped nor authorized to confront. Federal agents carried legal authority that transcended anything in their experience, and both men understood they were witnessing the complete destruction of the criminal organization that had employed them. "This isn't possible," Preston whispered, his voice barely audible. His expensive clothes suddenly felt like a costume he had been wearing to play a role he was unqualified for. "You're just a tenant, Section 8, single mother. You can't be." FBI Special Agent Nia Brooks, she replied, her credentials still extended, at eye level like a weapon that had been drawn and aimed at his heart. "Federal Housing Discrimination Task Force. 3 years of investigation into organized civil rights violations. You've been our primary target for 18 months. The weight of federal authority pressed down on Preston like gravity had suddenly tripled around him. Every assumption he had made about power, protection, and privilege crumbled in real time as he realized that his local connections meant nothing against federal investigation. Commissioner Victor Kane couldn't help him. Detective Theo Whitaker couldn't suppress reports. Judge Elias Ford couldn't dismiss charges that would be filed in federal court. Zoe had stopped trembling against her mother's leg, her 6-year-old intuition recognizing that the balance of power had shifted completely. The men who had seemed so threatening moments earlier now looked small and frightened, their aggressive postures replaced by the defeated slumping of people who understood they had lost everything. "The recording equipment in your apartment," Preston said, his voice hollow as pieces of the investigation clicked into place. "The questions about tenant rights, the complaints you filed. It was all evidence gathering," Nia confirmed. "Every discriminatory practice, every corrupt official, every violation of federal law has been documented with enough detail to support RICO prosecution. Your network isn't just facing housing discrimination charges, you're facing organized criminal enterprise charges with federal conspiracy enhancements." Preston's legs nearly buckled as he comprehended the legal reality, closing around him like a trap that had been 15 years in the making. RICO charges carried sentences measured in decades, not years. Asset forfeiture would claim every property he owned, every investment he had made, every dollar he had earned through systematic civil rights violations. The fortune he had built by destroying minority families would be redistributed to fund programs supporting the communities he had devastated. "But you lived here," he said desperately, grasping for any detail that might prove this was an elaborate mistake. "Your daughter goes to school here. You work as a medical assistant. I verified your employment." "Federal cover identity," Nia replied. "Established over 6 months before I moved into your property. The FBI has been planning your takedown since we identified your pattern of systematic discrimination. Everything you verified was designed to make you comfortable enough to commit federal crimes while we documented them." The morning sun climbed higher, casting everything in sharp relief that seemed to emphasize how completely Preston's world had changed in less than 60 seconds. His intimidation squad now stood like defeated soldiers, their presence transformed from threatening to pathetic. The courtyard, that had been his stage for another performance of racial domination, had become the setting for his complete humiliation. Mrs. Lila Voss continued recording from her window above, her arthritis slowed fingers steady as she documented justice being served in real time. The elderly woman had witnessed enough injustice in her 73 years to recognize the profound significance of watching systematic racism collide with federal law enforcement. "The other tenants," Preston said, his voice breaking as he realized the scope of the evidence against him. "Sofia Alvarez, the Martinez family, everyone who filed complaints, Federal witnesses, Nia confirmed. Every family you targeted, every person you displaced, every community you destroyed has been interviewed by federal investigators. Your pattern of discrimination has been documented across 7 neighborhoods and 12 years of systematic civil rights violations. Preston Locke, who had spent 15 years believing his money and connections made him untouchable, stood in his own courtyard facing the complete destruction of everything he had built through organized hatred. The problem tenant he had come to intimidate was actually the federal agent who would spend the next decade of his life ensuring he never again had the power to destroy minority families. The distinctive sound of multiple vehicles approaching at high speed shattered the morning quiet that had settled over the courtyard. After Nia's revelation, Preston turned toward the parking lot with the desperate hope that someone might be coming to rescue him. But the black SUVs bearing federal license plates crushed that possibility, with the finality of coffin nails being hammered home. Agent Kai Lennox emerged from the lead vehicle with the controlled precision of someone who had been coordinating this moment for months. His federal vest was clearly marked FBI, his weapon visible but holstered, his entire demeanor radiating the quiet confidence of law enforcement officers who held every legal advantage. Behind him came a full federal response team, each agent moving with the practiced efficiency of people executing a plan that had been rehearsed dozens of times. Special Agent Brooks, Lennox called across the courtyard, his voice carrying the relief of someone whose carefully orchestrated operation had proceeded exactly as planned. Federal response teams are in position across 8 cities. Simultaneous arrests are beginning now. Preston watched more federal agents emerge from additional vehicles, each one representing another nail in the coffin of his criminal empire. Their presence transformed the apartment complex into a federal crime scene, complete with surveillance equipment, recording devices, and the kind of professional authority that made his local connections irrelevant. Gino and Dax stood frozen, their intimidation training suddenly useless against opponents they had never been prepared to encounter. Federal agents carried legal authority that transcended anything in their experience, and both men understood they were witnessing the complete destruction of the organization that had employed them for years. Gino Moretti and Dax Harlan, Agent Lennox announced, consulting a federal warrant that had been prepared months in advance. You are under arrest for conspiracy to violate civil rights under federal law, criminal intimidation, and participation in organized criminal enterprise. Additional agents moved forward with handcuffs, their movements smooth and professional, as they secured Preston's accomplices. Neither man offered resistance, their earlier aggression evaporating in the face of federal authority. They were neither equipped nor authorized to confront. Preston watched his associates being processed like common criminals, their intimidating presence reduced to pathetic compliance in less than 2 minutes. The men who had helped him terrorize families for years were being treated exactly like what they were: hired thugs whose criminal careers had ended the moment they agreed to threaten a federal agent's child. Commissioner Victor Kane is being arrested at Housing Authority headquarters, Agent Lennox reported to Nia, his voice carrying updates from coordinated raids happening across the city. Detective Theo Whitaker is in federal custody. Judge Elias Ford's chambers are being searched by federal warrant. Banking records from all 3 institutions have been seized. Each name represented another domino falling in Preston's criminal network, another corrupt official facing federal prosecution for their role in systematic civil rights violations. The local power structure he had spent 15 years constructing was being dismantled in real time by federal investigators who had been planning this moment since they first identified patterns of organized discrimination. Zoe pressed closer to her mother, no longer trembling with fear but wide-eyed with fascination at the sudden appearance of so many official vehicles and uniformed agents. The 6-year-old's trauma was being replaced by the security of watching her mother command respect from powerful adults who moved quickly to follow her instructions. Mrs. Lila Voss, Agent Lennox called toward the 3rd-floor window where the elderly woman continued recording. Federal prosecutors would like to interview you about what you witnessed and recorded this morning. Your documentation will be crucial evidence in federal court. Lila waved her phone from her window, her arthritis-slowed voice carrying clearly across the courtyard. 17 years I've been waiting for someone to do something about this man. I have every confrontation recorded on my phone. Preston felt his knees nearly buckle as he realized that independent witnesses had been documenting his crimes for years, creating a reservoir of evidence that would support federal prosecution beyond any reasonable doubt. His careful legal strategies, designed to avoid leaving paper trails, had been useless against neighbors who had been recording his violations and storing them on devices he couldn't control or corrupt. Preston Locke, Agent Lennox announced, approaching with federal handcuffs that gleamed in the morning sunlight. You are under arrest for conspiracy to violate civil rights under federal law, housing discrimination, criminal intimidation, organized criminal enterprise, and federal conspiracy charges under RICO statutes. The handcuffs clicked shut around Preston's wrists with the finality of doors closing on his freedom for what would likely be decades. Federal custody meant federal prosecution, federal sentencing guidelines, and federal prison time that would be measured in significant portions of his remaining life. Federal prosecutors estimate your network displaced over 3,000 minority families. Agent Lennox continued, as he secured Preston's restraints. Asset forfeiture proceedings will claim every property, every investment, every dollar earned through systematic civil rights violations. The communities you destroyed will receive federal funding for housing assistance programs. Preston's entire fortune, built through 15 years of organized hatred, would be redistributed to support the families he had victimized. The poetic justice was so complete it seemed scripted, but federal investigators had learned that reality often exceeded fiction when systematic racism finally faced systematic accountability. Additional federal vehicles arrived, transporting evidence collection teams, witness protection specialists, and prosecutors who would spend the next year building cases designed to ensure Preston's network never again had the power to destroy minority families. The apartment complex had become the center of the largest housing discrimination prosecution in federal law enforcement history. Nia lifted Zoe into her arms, feeling her daughter's small body finally relaxing against her chest. As federal agents secured the scene around them, 3 months of undercover work had culminated in this moment of complete victory over systematic oppression. But the personal cost of exposing her child to trauma would require careful healing in the months ahead. Phase 1 complete, Agent Lennox reported into his radio, his voice carrying to federal coordinators across 8 cities. Primary target secured, network dismantled, ready for federal prosecution. Preston Locke, who had awakened that morning believing he would intimidate another minority family into submission, was now facing federal charges that would consume the rest of his life. His 10-minute ultimatum had become his confession to crimes that would redefine housing discrimination enforcement for years to come. The Federal Command Center, established in Agent Kai Lennox's mobile unit, looked like the nerve center of a military operation, which in many ways it was, a coordinated assault on systematic racism that had been embedded in American housing for decades. Multiple screens displayed real-time feeds from arrests happening simultaneously across 8 cities, each capture representing another node in Preston Locke's criminal network being severed permanently. Detroit Field Office confirms arrest of Regional Housing Coordinator Marcus Steinberg, came the report through federal communications. 17 fabricated inspection reports recovered, targeting exclusively minority tenants for building code violations that were later proven non-existent. Agent Lennox coordinated responses, while Nia provided real-time intelligence about Preston's operation that she had gathered during 3 months of undercover work. Her detailed knowledge of the conspiracy structure was proving invaluable as federal teams moved against targets who had believed their local connections made them untouchable. Chicago confirms arrest of mortgage coordinator Janet Walsh at First National Bank. Another voice reported, computer records show systematic denial of minority loan applications using fabricated criteria. Over 400 families affected across 3 neighborhoods targeted for gentrification. Even federal investigators who had long tracked organized discrimination were shocked by how far-reaching the conspiracy was. Preston's network was not merely a local operation. Rather, it is part of a systematic project to shift the population of America. It included systematic violations of civil rights, which displaced thousands of minorities. This made him over millions of dollars in illegal profits. Nia had Zoe in her arms, who had finally settled down after shaking and was actively listening to the police officer arresting them. The 6-year-old did not grasp the legal complexities of her situation, but she sensed that the adults who had threatened her were now impotent, while her mother commanded respect from everyone, including federal agents. Phoenix Field Office reports arrests of City Planning Commission Chairman David Torres and Zoning Administrator Lisa Chen. Came another update. Coordinated rezoning violations designed to force minority businesses out of profitable districts. Federal Financial Crimes Unit estimates $7 million in unlawful property value manipulation. Preston stood in federal handcuffs watching his life's work being systematically dismantled through radio reports that detailed each component of his criminal empire. Every corrupt official he had cultivated, every illegal partnership he had formed, every discriminatory practice he had institutionalized, was being exposed and prosecuted under federal law that carried sentences measured in decades. The banking connections alone constitute federal conspiracy charges. Agent Lennox explained to federal prosecutors arriving on scene. Coordinated lending discrimination across state lines, systematic redlining practices, and mortgage fraud targeting minority communities. Financial Crimes Enforcement Network has been tracking suspicious transaction patterns for 18 months. What made Preston's operation particularly devastating was how it had corrupted institutions designed to protect civil rights. Housing authorities had been turned into weapons against the families they were supposed to serve. Police departments had been enlisted to criminalize normal behavior when engaged in by minority residents. Courts had been manipulated to process evictions without proper legal representation for tenants who couldn't afford private attorneys. Federal Civil Rights Division confirms this is the largest housing discrimination prosecution in department history. Lennox reported to his superiors, 17 federal districts involved, 43 corrupt officials arrested. Estimated damages exceeding $200 million over 12 years of systematic violations. Nia's investigation had revealed that Preston's network operated like a business franchise, with experienced discriminators training new operatives in tactics that had been refined over years of practice. They had developed sophisticated methods for documenting false violations, creating legal pretexts for evictions, and coordinating with corrupt officials to ensure their activities appeared legitimate to casual scrutiny. The training materials recovered from Preston's office detail systematic civil rights violations like a corporate manual. Agent Lennox continued, step-by-step instructions for targeting minority families, recommended language for avoiding federal detection, and contact information for corrupt officials in multiple jurisdictions. Federal financial investigators were tracing money flows that revealed the economic incentives driving the conspiracy. Property values in targeted neighborhoods increased by an average of 47% after minority families were displaced, generating profits that were shared among network participants through carefully structured payments designed to avoid federal banking reporting requirements. Asset forfeiture proceedings will recover every dollar earned through systematic civil rights violations. Federal prosecutors announced properties will be transferred to community development corporations, illegal profits will fund housing assistance programs, and affected families will receive federal restitution payments. The poetic justice was so complete, it seemed orchestrated, but federal investigators had learned that systematic oppression, when finally confronted with systematic accountability, often produced results that exceeded the most optimistic hopes for legal redemption. Preston's criminal network had operated for 12 years, believing that local corruption could shield them from federal consequences. They had systematically destroyed minority families' lives while generating millions in illegal profits, confident that their victims lacked the resources or connections to seek meaningful justice. What they hadn't anticipated was that federal law enforcement had been planning their destruction for years, documenting every violation while building cases designed to ensure they never again had the power to destroy communities. The problem tenants they had victimized were about to become the beneficiaries of the largest civil rights settlement in housing law enforcement history. Agent Nia Brooks had accomplished more than arresting individual criminals. She had exposed and dismantled a systematic threat to civil rights that had operated across multiple states for over a decade. Her 3 months of undercover work had produced evidence that would reshape housing discrimination enforcement for years to come. Mrs. Lila Voss had uploaded her video to social media within minutes of Preston's arrest, but she hadn't anticipated how quickly 17 years of documented injustice would explode across digital platforms. When combined with federal law enforcement validation, her arthritis-slowed fingers had created what would become the most shared civil rights video in internet history. The footage was devastating in its clarity. A well-dressed landlord using child endangerment as psychological warfare against a minority family, only to discover his victim was actually a federal agent who had been documenting his crimes for months. The moment Preston's phone slipped from his hands when Nia revealed her FBI credentials had been captured in perfect resolution, creating an image that would define housing discrimination prosecutions for years to come. "Holy shit!" became the most common comment as viewers watched Preston's arrogance transform into terror in real time. "This is why you don't mess with federal agents" appeared thousands of times as people shared the video across every platform that supported video content. But what made Lila's recording particularly powerful was how it captured Zoe's fear and Preston's deliberate exploitation of a 6-year-old's trauma for intimidation purposes. Viewers could hear the little girl's whispered plea asking her mother not to let anyone take her away, followed by Preston's sadistic laughter as he threatened to call Child Protective Services. If anyone ever needed proof that housing discrimination is real and systematic, this is it, wrote civil rights attorney Devin Hale in a post that was retweeted 50,000 times. This man was literally threatening to destroy a family for sport, and he had the local system backing him up. Major news networks picked up the story within hours, transforming Mrs. Lila Voss's phone recording into lead segments on every major broadcast. The combination of child endangerment, federal investigation, and systematic racism created perfect television that generated massive audience engagement while advancing important social justice narratives. CNN breaking news: federal housing discrimination ring exposed through undercover FBI investigation. Scrolled across television screens in homes, offices, and waiting rooms across the country. The chyron couldn't capture the complexity of the story, but it communicated the essential elements that made viewers stop whatever they were doing to watch. Investigative journalist Mia Kessler had been following housing discrimination stories for years, but Preston's arrest provided her with sources and documentation that transformed individual anecdotes into comprehensive exposure of systematic civil rights violations. Her article, The Landlord Network: How Organized Racism Reshapes American Housing, became required reading in law schools and civil rights organizations. What makes Preston Locke's operation so devastating, Kessler wrote, is how it perverted institutions designed to protect civil rights into weapons against the communities they were supposed to serve. Housing authorities, police departments, courts, and banks were all corrupted to serve an agenda of systematic displacement that generated millions in illegal profits. Social media platforms struggled to manage the volume of engagement Lila's video generated. The hashtag #GetOutChallenge became a rallying cry for housing justice advocates, while federal justice celebrated law enforcement's systematic response to systematic oppression. Both hashtags trended globally for over a week, generating millions of posts from people sharing their own experiences with housing discrimination. "My family was forced out of our home by tactics exactly like this" became a common theme as victims of similar discrimination found courage to share their stories publicly for the first time. The federal validation of Nia's investigation gave credibility to experiences that had previously been dismissed as isolated incidents or misunderstandings. Civil rights organizations that had been tracking housing discrimination for years suddenly found themselves inundated with new reports from families who had previously suffered in silence. The visibility of Preston's federal prosecution convinced victims that their experiences would be taken seriously by law enforcement agencies that had previously seemed uninterested in their complaints. The FBI's systematic response to systematic racism represents a paradigm shift in civil rights enforcement, wrote legal scholar Dr. Patricia Williams in an analysis that was cited by federal judges in subsequent discrimination cases. This prosecution demonstrates that federal law enforcement finally understands that individual prosecutions cannot address the organized nature of modern civil rights violations. Community organizer Ramon Salazar had been fighting housing discrimination in Preston's target neighborhoods for over a decade, but federal validation of what activists had been documenting gave new power to grassroots organizing efforts that had previously been dismissed by local officials. We've been telling people for years that housing discrimination wasn't random individual prejudice. It was organized criminal activity, Salazar said in interviews that were broadcast nationally. Now we have federal prosecutors saying the same thing. And suddenly everyone wants to listen. The economic implications of Preston's prosecution extended beyond individual justice to broader questions about how systematic racism functioned as an economic engine that concentrated wealth while displacing communities. Federal asset forfeiture proceedings would redistribute millions of dollars to programs supporting affordable housing, but the broader system that had enabled Preston's operation required structural changes that went beyond individual prosecutions. Mrs. Lila Voss, whose arthritis slowed fingers had documented justice being served in real time, became an unlikely celebrity in civil rights circles. Her 17 years of recording discriminatory behavior had created an archive that federal prosecutors called the most comprehensive documentation of systematic housing discrimination in law enforcement history. I just kept recording because I knew someday someone would need to see what was really happening, Lila told reporters gathered outside her apartment building. 17 years of watching families destroyed, and finally someone with power decided to do something about it. The elderly woman's stubbornness converted personal agony into federal proof that would save thousands of families from similar abuse. The recording on her phone not only captured Preston's arrest, rather it captured the moment that systemic racism collided with systemic accountability. It would set a precedent for future generations for enforcing housing discrimination. Agent Nia Brooks observed media coverage from a federal headquarters, confident that after 3 months undercover her efforts would achieve more than individual arrests. Over the past decade, she had revealed and broken apart a civil rights thread that spanned several states, creating precedents that would protect minority families from systemic discrimination for many years to come. Within 48 hours of Preston Locke's arrest, the establishment forces that had profited from his network began mobilizing with the kind of coordinated response that revealed just how deeply systematic discrimination had penetrated legitimate institutions. The federal prosecution wasn't just threatening individual criminals, it was exposing an entire economic ecosystem that had generated billions in profits through organized civil rights violations. Mayor Catherine Richardson called an emergency press conference from City Hall. Steps that had been carefully staged to project authority and reassurance to voters who might question how their elected officials had failed to detect a criminal conspiracy operating in plain sight for over a decade. Her prepared statement had been crafted by crisis management specialists who understood that federal prosecutions could destroy political careers if not handled with surgical precision. While we take all allegations of discrimination seriously, Richardson announced to assembled reporters, we must be careful not to rush to judgment based on preliminary federal claims that have yet to be proven in court. Preston Locke is entitled to due process, and we cannot allow media speculation to undermine our confidence in the institutions that serve our community. The mayor's carefully worded statement was designed to distance city government from Preston's network, while avoiding any admission that local officials had failed in their oversight responsibilities. What she didn't mention was that federal investigators had documented over 40 meetings between Preston and city officials, including planning sessions where demographic targeting strategies had been discussed explicitly. Real estate industry representatives moved quickly to contain damage to property values that could result from federal investigations into systematic discrimination. The Metropolitan Property Owners Association issued statements characterizing Preston's prosecution as federal overreach that threatened legitimate business practices with expensive legal uncertainty. Property owners have the right to select tenants based on legitimate business criteria, declared Association President Michael Brennan in interviews designed to frame discrimination as market forces. Federal prosecutors are criminalizing normal landlord activities that protect property values and ensure neighborhood stability. Brennan's organization had received over $2 million in payments from Preston's network over the past 5 years, funding lobbying efforts that had successfully blocked local fair housing initiatives while promoting zoning changes that facilitated systematic displacement of minority communities. Banking industry lawyers worked overtime to separate their clients from federal conspiracy charges that could trigger massive civil liability beyond criminal prosecution. Internal emails recovered by federal investigators revealed that loan discrimination had been coordinated through industry conferences where targeting strategies were shared among institutions across multiple states. Our client institutions followed all applicable federal lending guidelines, insisted corporate attorney Sarah Mitchell in legal filings that would eventually prove disastrously incorrect. Any appearance of discriminatory patterns resulted from legitimate risk assessment procedures that are standard throughout the industry. Federal bank regulators have documented, coordinated, and suspicious lending activities by a number of banks that have been ongoing for 3 years. The regulators have found evidence that these banks systematically denied mortgage loan applications from minority people while approving identical applications from white people with lower credit qualifications. U.S. District Judge Elias Ford, who is facing a federal criminal indictment in connection with the processing of fraudulent evictions, tried to portray his courtroom as so busy that he cannot address individual cases as they arise. His lawyer's argument disregarded federal evidence, indicating that eviction actions were processed considerably faster when involving minority tenants than with white tenants, who were afforded more time for tenant representation. Your Honor, Ford's attorney argued in federal court, my client processed over 3,000 housing cases annually with limited resources and staff support. Any appearance of disparate treatment resulted from administrative efficiency requirements, not discriminatory intent. Federal investigators had documented that Ford's efficiency involved predetermined outcomes for cases involving Preston's properties, with eviction orders prepared before hearings began and tenant objections routinely overruled without consideration of presented evidence. Media organizations that had previously ignored systematic discrimination allegations suddenly found themselves defending their failure to investigate patterns that federal agents had been tracking for years. Editorial boards published retrospective analyses claiming that housing discrimination was too complex for standard journalism to detect without federal law enforcement resources. Local news organizations lack the investigative capacity to uncover federal-level criminal conspiracies, wrote Metro Daily editor James Walsh in an editorial that avoided mentioning the dozens of civil rights advocates who had been providing detailed documentation of Preston's activities for years. Mia Kessler's investigative reporting had proven that standard journalism could absolutely expose systematic discrimination when reporters were willing to prioritize civil rights over maintaining relationships with powerful sources. Her articles had documented Preston's network months before federal arrests began, but establishment media had dismissed her work as activist journalism rather than legitimate investigation. Political consultants advising officials connected to Preston's network recommended strategies that focused on discrediting federal prosecutors rather than addressing the documented civil rights violations. Opposition research targeted Agent Nia Brooks and federal prosecutors, searching for personal or professional controversies that could be used to undermine their credibility. Federal agents often exceed their authority in high-profile cases, suggested political operative David Chin in strategy memos that were later subpoenaed by federal investigators. Public attention creates pressure for dramatic prosecutions that may not be supported by sufficient evidence. What these consultants failed to understand was that federal civil rights prosecutions involved evidence standards that exceeded those required for local criminal cases. Nia's 3 months of undercover work had generated documentation that met federal conspiracy requirements while protecting against defense challenges that typically undermine discrimination cases. The coordinated response from establishment forces revealed that Preston's network wasn't an anomaly. It was part of a broader system that had institutionalized discrimination while maintaining plausible deniability through legal and political structures that protected perpetrators from accountability. Federal prosecutors recognized the establishment backlash as confirmation that their investigation had identified a systematic threat rather than isolated criminal behavior. The intensity of resistance to prosecution proved that dismantling discrimination networks required federal authority that could overcome local corruption and political protection. Agent Nia Brooks watched the establishment response while preparing for testimony that would document not just Preston's individual crimes, but the broader system that had enabled his operation. Her undercover investigation had revealed that systematic racism functioned like organized crime, requiring law enforcement responses that matched the sophistication and coordination of the criminal enterprise. The federal validation of systematic housing discrimination gave voice to thousands of victims who had previously suffered in silence, believing their experiences were isolated incidents rather than components of organized civil rights violations. Within days of Preston's arrest, civil rights organizations found themselves inundated with testimonies from families whose stories revealed the true scope of the conspiracy that federal investigators had only begun to document. Sofia Alvarez had been one of the first tenants to respond to federal investigators' requests for victim testimony. Her family's displacement from Preston's property 3 years earlier had followed the exact pattern that Agent Nia Brooks documented: fabricated lease violations, harassment through surprise inspections, and threats involving child protective services that were designed to terrorize parents into abandoning their legal rights. They made us feel like criminals for paying rent on time and keeping our apartment clean, Sofia testified in federal depositions that would become crucial evidence in RICO prosecution. My children learned to be afraid when they heard heavy footsteps in the hallway because it usually meant someone was coming to find problems that didn't exist. Sofia's testimony revealed that Preston's network had refined psychological warfare tactics through years of practice, developing methods that maximized trauma while maintaining legal deniability. Children were deliberately targeted for intimidation because parental protective instincts could be weaponized against families who might otherwise resist illegal eviction attempts. The Martinez family had been displaced from their home of 12 years through a coordinated campaign that involved false police reports, fabricated building code violations, and mortgage discrimination that prevented them from purchasing property in neighborhoods where they had lived peacefully for over a decade. We called the police when neighbors complained about noise that was coming from the apartment upstairs, but the reports always said the complaints were about us, testified Maria Martinez in federal court. Our children couldn't have friends over because we were afraid someone would call in more false reports about parties or disturbances. Federal investigators discovered that Detective Theo Whitaker had filed over 60 false police reports involving Preston's properties, systematically attributing complaints to minority tenants, regardless of the actual source of problems. The pattern was so consistent that federal prosecutors could predict which families would be targeted based solely on demographics and lease terms. Community organizer Ramon Salazar had been documenting displacement patterns for 8 years before federal investigators validated what grassroots activists had been reporting to indifferent local authorities. His organization had compiled detailed records showing that minority families were being systematically removed from neighborhoods, subsequently experienced dramatic property value increases. We had maps showing exactly which blocks were being cleared and which families were being targeted, Salazar testified before federal civil rights committees. Local officials ignored our documentation, but we kept recording because we knew someday someone with power would want to see the evidence. Salazar's community organizing had created a network of witnesses who could testify about coordination between Preston's associates and city officials who facilitated displacement through selective enforcement of building codes, zoning violations, and business licensing requirements that affected only minority-owned establishments. Dr. Serena Patel, the child psychologist treating trauma in families affected by Preston's operations, documented psychological damage that extended beyond immediate victims to entire communities where children learned to associate their racial identity with vulnerability to arbitrary authority. Children in affected neighborhoods developed anxiety disorders related to housing insecurity by age 6. Dr. Patel testified in federal hearings that established the broader impact of systematic discrimination. They learned that their families' safety depended on constant vigilance against officials who might declare their presence unwelcome at any moment. The psychological evidence proved that Preston's network had caused federal civil rights violations that would affect victims for generations, creating trauma patterns that would require extensive community mental health resources to address properly. Federal prosecutors used victim testimony to demonstrate the organized nature of Preston's conspiracy, showing that individual incidents were actually components of a systematic campaign that had displaced over 3,000 families while generating millions in illegal profits through coordinated civil rights violations. Each family's experience follows an identical pattern. Federal prosecutor Fiona Reyes argued in legal briefs that would reshape housing discrimination law. This isn't random prejudice, it's organized criminal activity that used racism as a business model. The testimony revealed that Preston's network had operated like a franchise, with experienced operatives training new participants in discrimination tactics that had been refined through years of practice. Training materials recovered from Preston's office included detailed instructions for targeting minority families while avoiding federal detection. Housing advocacy organizations that had been fighting discrimination for decades suddenly found themselves overwhelmed with new reports from families who had previously been afraid to seek help. Federal prosecution had demonstrated that systematic discrimination could be successfully challenged through coordinated law enforcement action. For the first time in my career, victims believe their complaints will be taken seriously, said housing advocate Jennifer Chen, whose organization had tracked Preston's activities for 5 years before federal investigators began their prosecution. Federal validation changed everything about how communities respond to discrimination. The victim testimony established that Preston's operation wasn't just criminal. It was systematic terrorism designed to reshape demographics through coordinated civil rights violations. Families had been targeted, not for individual behavior but for their racial identity, making their displacements a federal conspiracy that required federal prosecution under civil rights statutes. Devon Hale, the community organizer who had been fighting housing discrimination for over a decade, watched victim after victim find courage to testify publicly about experiences they had previously hidden from authorities who seemed uninterested in their suffering. Federal prosecution gave victims something they had never had before: proof that their experiences were real, systematic, and criminal. Hale observed in testimony before congressional committees investigating housing discrimination, "When the FBI validates your experience, you stop questioning whether you really experienced discrimination." The collective testimony created a comprehensive record of systematic civil rights violations that would support federal prosecution while establishing legal precedents for future discrimination cases. Preston's victims had become federal witnesses whose courage would protect other families from similar abuse. Agent Nia Brooks reviewed victim testimonies while preparing for trial testimony that would synthesize individual experiences into evidence of federal conspiracy. Her undercover investigation had documented the mechanics of systematic discrimination, but victim voices provided the human context that would help juries understand the devastating impact of organized civil rights violations. The voices rising in federal court represented more than individual justice. They documented the systematic nature of modern racism and proved that federal law enforcement could successfully challenge organized discrimination when equipped with proper resources and political support. Federal prosecutor Fiona Reyes stood before the grand jury with evidence that represented the most comprehensive housing discrimination case in Department of Justice history. The conference room walls were covered with organizational charts that mapped Preston Locke's criminal network across 8 states, financial records that documented millions in illegal profits, and victim testimonies that proved systematic civil rights violations affecting thousands of minority families. Ladies and gentlemen of the grand jury, Reyes began, her voice carrying the weight of 18 months of federal investigation. The evidence before you documents the largest organized civil rights conspiracy prosecuted under federal law. Preston Locke and his associates didn't just discriminate against individual families. They created a criminal enterprise that systematically violated the civil rights of minority communities while generating massive illegal profits. The indictment Reyes presented contained 47 separate charges, ranging from individual civil rights violations to federal conspiracy charges under RICO statutes that treated Preston's network as organized crime. Each charge carried potential sentences measured in decades, with asset forfeiture provisions that would claim every dollar Preston had earned through systematic discrimination. Count 1 charged Preston with conspiracy to violate civil rights under federal law, documenting his coordination with corrupt officials to systematically target minority families for illegal eviction. The evidence included recorded conversations where Preston explicitly discussed racial demographics as business strategy, training materials that provided instructions for avoiding federal detection while maximizing discrimination, financial records showing profit-sharing arrangements with corrupt officials. Count 2 detailed housing discrimination under the Fair Housing Act, with evidence proving that Preston's selection criteria were designed to exclude minority tenants regardless of their financial qualifications or rental history. Federal investigators had documented over 300 instances where minority applications were rejected using criteria that were waived for white applicants with identical or inferior qualifications. Counts 3 through 15 charged individual conspirators with their specific roles in the criminal enterprise, from Detective Theo Whitaker's false police reports to Commissioner Victor Kane's manipulation of housing authority resources. Each charge was supported by documented evidence that would be difficult to challenge in federal court. The RICO charges, in counts 16 through 25, were the most devastating, treating Preston's network as organized crime that had operated across state lines while corrupting legitimate institutions. RICO prosecution allowed federal prosecutors to claim every asset that had been acquired through criminal activity, essentially stripping Preston of his entire fortune, while ensuring his associates faced decades in federal prison. The financial evidence alone establishes criminal enterprise. Reyes explained to grand jurors who had spent 3 days reviewing documentation of systematic discrimination. $47 million in illegal profits generated through coordinated civil rights violations, distributed among network participants through carefully structured payments designed to avoid federal banking reporting requirements. Grand jury members had been particularly disturbed by evidence documenting the psychological warfare tactics Preston's network used against children to intimidate their parents into abandoning legal rights. Dr. Serena Patel's expert testimony had established that deliberate trauma inflicted on children for their parents' racial identity constituted federal civil rights violations with enhanced penalties. The testimony of Agent Nia Brooks provided the grand jury with insider evidence of how Preston's conspiracy operated on a day-to-day basis. Her 3 months of undercover work had generated recordings, documents, and witness statements that eliminated any possibility of successfully claiming that discrimination was unintentional or random. Special Agent Brooks's investigation represents the gold standard for federal civil rights enforcement, Reyes told the grand jury. Her evidence demonstrates that systematic discrimination requires systematic prosecution using federal resources that can overcome local corruption and political protection. Federal banking investigators had traced money flows through Preston's network that revealed coordination between institutions across multiple states. The systematic denial of mortgage applications to minority families, followed by immediate approval of identical applications from white families, established a pattern of discrimination that extended far beyond Preston's direct control. The banking conspiracy alone constitutes federal crimes that could result in decades of imprisonment, Reyes explained while presenting financial evidence that had been developed through 2 years of investigation. Coordinated lending discrimination across state lines, systematic redlining practices, and mortgage fraud targeting minority communities represent organized criminal activity that requires federal prosecution. Asset forfeiture proceedings would claim every property Preston owned, every investment he had made, and every dollar he had earned through systematic civil rights violations. Federal law allowed prosecutors to treat his entire fortune as proceeds from criminal activity, ensuring that communities he had victimized would receive restitution while he lost everything he had acquired through organized discrimination. The grand jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning indictments on all 47 charges. Federal prosecutors had presented evidence so comprehensive that grand jurors later described their decision as the easiest vote in the history of federal law enforcement. Preston Locke's criminal empire, built through 15 years of systematic discrimination, had been reduced to federal charges that would consume the rest of his life, while redistributing his wealth to communities he had victimized. Preston Locke sat in federal detention reading indictments that detailed every aspect of his criminal empire with the kind of precision that made successful defense virtually impossible. His expensive attorney, Javier Morales, had warned him that federal civil rights prosecutions carried conviction rates exceeding 95% when supported by the level of evidence Agent Nia Brooks had gathered during her undercover investigation. "We need to consider plea negotiations," Morales suggested during their first attorney-client conference in the federal detention facility. RICO charges with civil rights enhancements could result in life imprisonment. The asset forfeiture alone will claim everything you've ever owned. Preston's face flushed with the kind of rage that had driven his criminal career. But federal detention had stripped him of the power to intimidate anyone into compliance with his demands. Guards treated him like any other federal prisoner awaiting trial, and his wealth meant nothing in an environment where federal authority superseded local connections. "I want to fight this," Preston declared, his voice carrying desperation disguised as determination. "That FBI bitch entrapped me. She was living in my property, under false pretenses, recording private conversations without consent. This whole investigation violates my constitutional rights." Morales had handled enough federal cases to recognize the futility of constitutional challenges against evidence gathered through proper federal surveillance warrants. Agent Brooks had operated under full federal authority with judicial approval for every recording device, every surveillance technique, and every undercover operation that had documented Preston's crimes. Entrapment defenses require proving that law enforcement induced criminal behavior that wouldn't have occurred otherwise, Morales explained with the patience of someone whose client needed education about federal law. Agent Brooks documented criminal activity that had been ongoing for 15 years. "She didn't create your conspiracy, she exposed it." Preston's attempt to challenge the federal investigation revealed how completely he had misunderstood the scope of law enforcement authority when applied to systematic civil rights violations. Local corruption had protected him for years, but federal prosecutors operated under entirely different rules that rendered his political connections irrelevant. "What about the other arrests?" Preston asked, grasping for any information that might suggest his associates were successfully challenging their prosecutions. "Kane Whitaker, the banking people, are they fighting or pleading?" Morales consulted legal documents that told the story of a criminal network collapsing under federal pressure. Commissioner Victor Kane had already entered guilty pleas in exchange for cooperation against higher-level conspirators. Detective Theo Whitaker was providing testimony about coordination with Preston's network in exchange for reduced sentences. Banking officials were pleading guilty to avoid RICO charges that would have resulted in decades of imprisonment. "Your associates are cooperating with federal prosecutors," Morales reported, watching Preston's face pale as he realized that his criminal network was being systematically dismantled through plea agreements that would provide additional evidence against him. They're testifying about your role in organizing the conspiracy in exchange for sentence reductions. The cooperation agreements eliminated any possibility that Preston could successfully claim ignorance about his network's criminal activities. Former associates were providing detailed testimony about planning meetings, profit-sharing arrangements, and coordination strategies that Preston had personally directed over more than a decade of systematic discrimination. "I want to expose the real conspiracy," Preston said, his voice taking on the paranoid tone of someone whose understanding of reality was crumbling under federal prosecution. "This is political prosecution designed to destroy successful businessmen who protect property values." Agent Brooks was part of a federal plot to criminalize legitimate business practices. Morales recognized the desperation of a client whose criminal career had been so thoroughly documented that conspiracy theories represented his only psychological defense against overwhelming evidence of guilt. Federal investigators had recorded Preston's own words describing racial targeting strategies, documented his coordination with corrupt officials, and established financial evidence that proved systematic civil rights violations. Federal prosecutors have 18 months of recorded conversations where you explicitly discuss racial demographics as business strategy, Morales explained, reading from discovery materials that detail the evidence against his client. They have financial records proving coordination with corrupt officials. They have victim testimony from over 300 families. This isn't political prosecution. It's law enforcement responding to systematic criminal activity. Preston's final desperate strategy involved attempting to destroy evidence that federal investigators had already secured through multiple independent sources. His associates in federal detention reported that he was asking questions about witness intimidation, evidence tampering, and other obstruction tactics that would only add additional federal charges to his already devastating indictment. Any attempt to interfere with federal witnesses or evidence will result in additional charges, Morales warned his client, recognizing the self-destructive thinking that federal prosecution often triggered in defendants whose entire identity was built around power they no longer possessed. "You're facing life imprisonment under current charges. Obstruction would guarantee that outcome." Federal prosecutors expected that Preston would seek to corrupt witnesses or evidence. They organized Agent Nia Brooks's undercover investigation to generate multiple independent sources of evidence that could not be eliminated through traditional means of intimidation. Preston's criminal enterprise was so thoroughly documented that prosecution was inevitable, despite any last-ditch efforts to thwart the feds. Over the course of 15 years, he built an impressive criminal career with systematic discrimination, but it was reduced to federal evidence that would consume the rest of his life. Preston Locke had long been convinced that his money and connections rendered him untouchable. However, he now finds himself facing federal charges that threaten to take away everything he has amassed through organized violations of civil rights. Furthermore, these charges will ensure that he spends his remaining years in federal prison. The community center on Maple Street had never hosted a meeting like the one that filled every seat, lined the walls with standing attendees, and spilled into the parking lot, where speakers had been set up to accommodate overflow crowds. 3 weeks after Preston Locke's arrest, families who had suffered in isolation for years discovered they were part of a community that had been systematically targeted by organized criminals who used racism as a business model. Devon Hale stood at the front of the packed room, reading names from a list that had grown to over 400 families who had been displaced by Preston's network over the past 15 years. Each name represented not just individual suffering, but evidence of systematic civil rights violations that federal prosecutors would use to establish the scope of organized criminal enterprise. The Johnson family, forced out in 2018 after false building code violations, Devon announced, his voice carrying across the crowded room. The Williams family, evicted in 2019 after fabricated noise complaints. The Rodriguez family, displaced in 2020 through coordinated mortgage discrimination. As each name was read, family members stood to acknowledge their experiences, while community members applauded in recognition of suffering that had been invisible to authorities who were supposed to protect civil rights. The federal validation of systematic discrimination had transformed individual trauma into collective strength. Sofia Alvarez took the microphone to describe her family's displacement 3 years earlier. But this time her testimony was met with recognition rather than dismissal. "They made us feel like we were crazy for thinking the harassment was coordinated," she said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "Now we know we weren't paranoid. We were victims of organized crime." The community organizing effort that emerged from Preston's prosecution represented more than victim support. It was a systematic response to systematic oppression that would reshape housing advocacy for years to come. Federal validation had given communities tools they had never possessed: proof that discrimination was criminal, evidence that resistance was justified, and legal precedents that would protect future families from similar abuse. Ramon Salazar had been fighting housing discrimination for over a decade, but federal prosecution had transformed grassroots organizing into a movement with legal authority and financial resources. Asset forfeiture from Preston's network would fund community development programs, legal assistance for discrimination victims, and advocacy organizations that would monitor future civil rights violations. "For the first time in my career, we have federal prosecutors treating housing discrimination as organized crime," Salazar told the crowd, his voice carrying the satisfaction of someone whose warnings had finally been validated by law enforcement. "We're not asking for help anymore. We're demanding accountability." The meeting attracted families from neighborhoods across 8 cities where Preston's associates had operated similar schemes. Federal investigators had established that the discrimination network extended far beyond Preston's direct control, involving real estate professionals, banking officials, and government employees who had coordinated systematic displacement of minority communities. Mrs. Lila Voss, whose 17 years of recording discriminatory behavior had provided crucial evidence for federal prosecution, received a standing ovation when she entered the community center. The elderly woman's persistence had transformed individual documentation into federal evidence that would protect thousands of families from systematic abuse. "I kept recording because I knew someday someone with power would want to see what was really happening," Lila told the crowd, her voice steady despite her 73 years. 17 years of watching families destroyed, and finally federal agents decided to do something about it. The community response revealed that Preston's prosecution had accomplished more than individual justice. It had demonstrated that systematic racism could be successfully challenged through coordinated community action supported by federal law enforcement. Families who had been isolated by trauma were connecting with others who shared similar experiences. Dr. Serena Patel, who had been treating children traumatized by Preston's intimidation tactics, addressed the community about healing resources that would be funded through federal asset forfeiture. "Community trauma requires community healing," she explained. "Federal prosecution has given us resources to address the psychological damage that systematic discrimination inflicted on entire neighborhoods." The mental health implications of Preston's prosecution extended beyond immediate victims to broader questions about how systematic racism functioned as community trauma that affected everyone who witnessed discrimination without having power to resist it effectively. Federal prosecutors had established a victim assistance program that would provide legal representation, mental health services, and housing assistance to families affected by Preston's network. The program represented unprecedented federal investment in community restoration following civil rights prosecutions. Community leaders who had been fighting housing discrimination for years suddenly found themselves with resources and legal authority they had never possessed. Federal validation had transformed grassroots advocacy into institutionally supported civil rights enforcement with power to prevent future systematic discrimination. This prosecution proves that organized racism requires organized resistance, declared community activist Jennifer Chin, whose organization had documented Preston's activities for 5 years before federal investigators began their prosecution. "We're not just responding to individual incidents anymore. We're building systems that can prevent systematic discrimination." The community awakening that followed the arrest of Preston represented a shift in civil rights that harnessed suffering into power. The community would seek more often to enforce the law, against housing discrimination. The federal prosecution gave communities evidence that organized resistance to systematic oppression could win if there was the right legal power behind it. Nia Brooks, an agent, attended the community meeting, along with Zoe, who had gotten over her earlier trauma and seemed intrigued by the adult attention on her mother's federal investigation. Although the 6-year-old did not quite understand the legal complexity of events, she did know that her experience had helped protect other families from abuse like this. Following Preston's prosecution, community organizing would continue past the trial with the emergence of permanent institutions designed to monitor housing discrimination and advocate for civil rights enforcement that matched the sophistication and coordination of the system. The success of Agent Nia Brooks's undercover investigation had attracted attention from federal civil rights enforcement agencies across the country, transforming Preston Locke's prosecution from an isolated case into a model for systematic approaches to organized discrimination. FBI field offices in 17 cities reported similar patterns of coordinated housing discrimination that suggested Preston's network was part of a much larger conspiracy. Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights Patricia Morrison convened a task force meeting in Washington that included representatives from FBI, Department of Housing and Urban Development, Federal Trade Commission, and Treasury Department investigators who had been tracking organized discrimination across multiple jurisdictions. The Preston Locke prosecution has revealed systematic civil rights violations that extend far beyond individual criminal activity. Morrison announced to the assembled federal agents, "We're seeing coordinated discrimination networks operating like organized crime syndicates, requiring federal responses that match the scope and sophistication of the criminal enterprises we're confronting." FBI intelligence analysts had identified similar operational patterns in 43 cities across 22 states, suggesting that systematic housing discrimination had evolved into a nationwide criminal industry that generated billions in illegal profits, while displacing hundreds of thousands of minority families. Financial intelligence indicates coordinated money flows between discrimination networks in different regions, reported Treasury Department analyst Michael Chen, presenting evidence of interstate banking coordination that supported systematic civil rights violations. "We're tracking suspicious transaction patterns that suggest national-level organization of local discrimination schemes." The federal task force had been established to coordinate investigations that were too large and complex for individual field offices to handle effectively. Preston's prosecution had demonstrated that successful civil rights enforcement required federal resources that could overcome local corruption while building cases that would deter future systematic discrimination. Agent Kai Lennox presented intelligence gathered during Preston's investigation that revealed connections to similar networks operating across the Southeast, Midwest, and West Coast. Training materials recovered from Preston's operation include contact information for discrimination consultants who provide services to networks in multiple states, he reported. Federal investigators had discovered that systematic discrimination had evolved into a professional service industry, with experienced operatives providing training, legal guidance, and operational support to networks that wanted to displace minority communities while avoiding federal prosecution. The discrimination consulting industry generates estimated revenues exceeding $500 million annually, reported Federal Trade Commission investigator Sarah Williams. Professional services include legal strategy, political protection, media management, and operational training that helps networks avoid federal detection. The scope of organized discrimination had exceeded what federal investigators had initially anticipated when Preston's prosecution began. What appeared to be isolated criminal activity was actually part of an industry that had systematized civil rights violations while developing sophisticated methods for avoiding accountability. Housing and urban development investigators had identified coordinated patterns of federal program abuse that suggested discrimination networks were exploiting government resources designed to support affordable housing while systematically excluding the minority families those programs were intended to serve. Federal housing assistance programs are being systematically corrupted to support discrimination rather than prevent it, reported HUD investigator David Martinez. Networks are using federal funding to facilitate displacement while maintaining legal compliance that protects them from oversight. The federal task force recommended expanding civil rights enforcement to include financial crimes prosecution, racketeering charges, and international money laundering investigation that could trace discrimination profits through complex financial structures designed to avoid federal detection. Preston Locke's prosecution represents the beginning of federal civil rights enforcement that matches the sophistication of organized discrimination. Morrison explained to task force members, "We're moving from individual case prosecution to systematic dismantling of criminal industries that have institutionalized civil rights violations." Federal prosecutors were working on legal strategies aimed at treating systematic discrimination as an organized crime. Such strategies could use RICO prosecution, asset forfeiture, and enhanced sentencing guidelines for civil rights violations affecting whole communities. FBI Field Office Commander Captain Oria Moreno had been coordinating with global intel agencies that were tracking the discrimination profits that were being invested in overseas real estate markets. According to her, systematic discrimination is a source of capital flight that impacts international housing markets. Federal law enforcement has often prioritized terrorism, money laundering, and organized crime. Now Washington is paying attention to more subdued but systematic discrimination with international implications. According to Preston's prosecution, the sophistication of the discrimination networks calls for coordinated federal responses. The U.S. government was changing federal civil rights enforcement to confront systematic discrimination, which it saw as a social stability threat. Such discrimination also produced criminal profits and corrupts legal institutions in multiple industries of the economy. The Preston Locke prosecution has established legal precedents that will reshape civil rights enforcement for decades. Morrison concluded in her report to federal leadership, "Systematic discrimination requires systematic prosecution using federal resources that can overcome local corruption, while building cases that deter future organized civil rights violations." Agent Nia Brooks had been selected to lead a new federal civil rights enforcement unit that would coordinate undercover investigations targeting systematic discrimination networks across the country. Her success in documenting Preston's criminal enterprise had established investigative protocols that would be replicated in federal field offices nationwide. The federal investigation expansion represented a paradigm shift in civil rights enforcement, transforming individual discrimination cases into systematic prosecution of organized criminal enterprises that had institutionalized racism while generating billions in illegal profits. Federal prosecutors were developing cases against discrimination networks in 12 additional cities, using evidence-gathering techniques that Agent Brooks had pioneered during her undercover investigation of Preston's operation. The systematic approach to systematic discrimination was being scaled to address organized civil rights violations across the entire country. Preston Locke's prosecution had inadvertently exposed a criminal industry that federal law enforcement was now committed to dismantling through coordinated investigation, prosecution, and prevention programs that would protect civil rights for generations to come. Federal prosecutor Fiona Reyes stood before the largest evidence board in Department of Justice history, reviewing 18 months of investigation that had transformed Preston Locke's housing discrimination into the most commercial civil rights prosecution ever undertaken by federal law enforcement. "This trial will establish legal precedents for civil rights enforcement," Reyes announced to her trial team. "We're not just prosecuting individual criminals, we're dismantling a criminal industry." The federal trial strategy required proving that Preston's network constituted organized criminal enterprise under RICO statutes. Agent Nia Brooks's undercover investigation had provided the framework for systematic prosecution of systematic crimes. Judge Miriam Soto, presiding over the federal trial, had experience with complex civil rights prosecutions, but Preston's case represented the largest systematic discrimination trial in federal court history. Her courtroom had been equipped with additional security and expanded seating for victims and media. Defense attorney Javier Morales had attempted every possible legal challenge to federal evidence, but Agent Brooks's investigation had been conducted under proper federal surveillance warrants, with judicial oversight that protected against constitutional violations. Federal prosecutors have documented every aspect of my client's alleged criminal activity, Morales admitted to Preston during trial preparation meetings in federal detention. Agent Brooks's undercover investigation eliminated most traditional defense strategies. Over 300 families would provide testimony documenting systematic discrimination that had destroyed their housing stability while generating illegal profits for criminal conspirators. Agent Nia Brooks reviewed her testimony preparation, knowing that her undercover investigation had produced evidence that would reshape civil rights enforcement for decades. The federal courthouse had never hosted a trial that attracted as much attention as United States Vichinifats in Preston Locke and Associates, with overflow crowds filling every available seat while national media documented proceedings that would reshape civil rights enforcement. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, Federal Prosecutor Fiona Reyes began her opening statement. The evidence you will hear documents the largest organized civil rights conspiracy prosecuted under federal law. Preston Locke and his associates created a criminal enterprise that systematically violated the civil rights of minority families while generating millions in illegal profits. Agent Nia Brooks took the witness stand on day 8 of trial, wearing her federal credentials and carrying documentation that represented 3 months of undercover investigation into Preston's criminal network. I lived in Preston Locke's property for 3 months while documenting systematic civil rights violations, Nia testified, her voice carrying the authority of someone whose investigation had exposed organized criminal activity. I recorded conversations where the defendant explicitly discussed racial targeting strategies, coordination with corrupt officials, and profit-sharing arrangements with criminal associates. Nia's testimony included audio recordings of Preston describing minority families as problems that needed to be cleaned up to protect property values. The recordings documented criminal intent that eliminated any possibility of claiming that discrimination was unintentional. Cross-examination by defense attorney Morales attempted to challenge Agent Brooks's investigative methods, but federal surveillance had been conducted under proper judicial oversight with constitutional protections. Agent Brooks, did you create the criminal activity you documented? Morales asked. I documented criminal activity that had been ongoing for 15 years before my investigation began, Nia replied firmly. The defendant's systematic discrimination was established through historical evidence, victim testimony, and financial records that predated any federal investigation. Sofia Alvarez testified about her family's displacement through fabricated lease violations and psychological warfare targeting her children. They used our love for our children as a weapon against us, she told the jury. Mrs. Lila Voss presented 17 years of documentation showing systematic harassment of minority families, including video recordings that captured Preston's criminal activities with devastating clarity. Preston watched his criminal empire being systematically dismantled through federal evidence that documented every aspect of his systematic discrimination. The federal jury deliberated for less than 6 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all 47 charges against Preston Locke and his criminal associates. The speed of deliberation reflected the overwhelming evidence that Agent Nia Brooks had gathered during 18 months of federal investigation. On count 1, conspiracy to violate civil rights under federal law. How do you find? Judge Miriam Soto asked the jury foreman. Guilty, Your Honor, the foreman replied. The verdict triggered emotional responses throughout the courtroom as families who had suffered systematic discrimination for years watched their oppressor face federal accountability. On the RICO conspiracy charges, Judge Soto announced, her voice emphasizing the historic significance of treating systematic discrimination as organized criminal enterprise. How do you find? Guilty on all RICO charges, Your Honor, the jury foreman declared, delivering justice that exceeded what civil rights advocates had believed possible. Federal sentencing 3 months later delivered justice that reflected the systematic nature of Preston's criminal enterprise. Judge Soto imposed 45 years in federal prison without possibility of parole, ensuring that Preston would spend the remainder of his life paying for 15 years of systematic discrimination. This sentence reflects the systematic nature of your crimes, Judge Soto announced. You created a criminal enterprise that displaced thousands of minority families while corrupting institutions designed to protect civil rights. Asset forfeiture proceedings claimed Preston's entire $47 million fortune, redistributing illegal profits to fund community development programs, victim assistance services, and civil rights enforcement initiatives. You didn't just steal our homes, Sofia Alvarez told Preston during sentencing proceedings. You stole our children's sense of safety, our community's trust in justice, and our faith that America would protect families like ours from systematic abuse. Agent Nia Brooks attended sentencing with Zoe, who had recovered from her initial trauma and understood that her mother's courage had protected other families from systematic abuse. 6 months after Preston Locke's federal conviction, Agent Nia Brooks stood in a secure conference room at FBI headquarters reviewing case files that represented the successful conclusion of the largest civil rights enforcement operation in Department of Justice history. The walls displayed maps marking successful prosecutions across the country, each pin representing families who had found justice through systematic federal intervention. Phase 1 complete, announced FBI Director Sarah Collins during a classified briefing. The Preston Locke prosecution has provided legal framework and investigative protocols that will guide systematic approaches to systematic discrimination. Project Rise had been established 3 years earlier to address organized civil rights violations that traditional law enforcement had failed to recognize or prosecute effectively. Agent Brooks's undercover investigation had proven that systematic discrimination required systematic federal responses, using resources and authority that could overcome decades of local corruption and institutional protection. 17 additional prosecutions are proceeding based on evidence-gathering techniques pioneered during Agent Brooks's investigation. Director Collins reported to assembled federal agents from field offices across the nation. We're dismantling discrimination networks in 43 cities while establishing precedents that will deter future systematic civil rights violation. The success had transformed federal civil rights enforcement from reactive case-by-case responses to proactive systematic investigation of organized discrimination. Training academies now taught Preston prosecution protocols as standard procedure for identifying and dismantling criminal networks that used racism as a business model. Agent Brooks has been selected to lead the Federal Civil Rights Enforcement Division, Director Collins announced, recognizing that her investigation had established new standards for systematic civil rights prosecution. The promotion came with resources that previous civil rights investigators could never have imagined: unlimited federal funding, multi-agency coordination authority, and direct access to intelligence networks. Nia accepted her promotion knowing that Preston's prosecution represented the beginning of federal civil rights enforcement that matched the sophistication of organized discrimination. Her new position would coordinate undercover operations across the country, ensuring that every systematic threat to civil rights faced systematic federal accountability. The ripple effects extended beyond law enforcement. Universities were developing new curricula based on Preston's prosecution, teaching future lawyers, social workers, and community organizers how to identify and document systematic discrimination before it could destroy entire communities. Medical schools were incorporating trauma-informed care protocols for families affected by housing discrimination, recognizing that systematic oppression created systematic health impacts requiring systematic healing approaches. Mrs. Lila Voss had become a federal consultant whose 17 years of documenting discrimination provided training materials for civil rights investigators across the country. Her methodology had been adapted into official FBI training protocols, teaching agents how individual documentation could build federal cases against organized criminal enterprises. Systematic discrimination requires systematic documentation, Lila explained to federal agents learning investigative techniques at the newly established Civil Rights Investigation Training Center. Individual incidents become evidence of organized crime when properly recorded and preserved for federal prosecution. The training center had been funded through asset forfeiture from Preston's network, creating permanent infrastructure for civil rights enforcement that would continue protecting communities long after current agents retired. Young investigators learned to recognize patterns that previous generations had been forced to ignore, equipped with federal authority that made systematic resistance to systematic oppression not just possible, but inevitable. Sofia Alvarez had become a victim advocate specialist, using her experience with Preston's network to help other families navigate federal civil rights investigations. Her testimony in Preston's trial had inspired dozens of other victims to come forward, creating a cascade of prosecutions that were dismantling discrimination networks across multiple states. When federal agents validate your experience, everything changes, Sofia explained to families beginning their own journeys toward justice. You stop questioning whether discrimination really happened, and you start building the evidence that will protect other families from similar abuse. Community organizing had evolved from grassroots advocacy to federally supported civil rights enforcement, with former victims becoming federal consultants who trained investigators and supported families through systematic prosecution of systematic oppression. Zoe Brooks had started second grade in a community where federal civil rights enforcement protected families from systematic discrimination. Her recovery from initial trauma represented the broader healing that occurred when systematic oppression faced systematic accountability, but more importantly, she represented the generation that would grow up knowing that federal law enforcement would protect their file rights. My mom catches bad people who hurt families, Zoe told her classmates during a school presentation about community helpers. Federal agents protect everyone so kids don't have to be scared of people who don't like them because of their skin. The child's knowledge showed a fundamental change in American communities' understanding of civil rights enforcement. Children who had previously learned to fear systematic discrimination were also taught that systematic justice was possible. It was guaranteed by federal law enforcement that matched the sophistication of organized oppression. Agent Nia Brooks looks over her next assignment. The prosecution of Preston established investigative protocols that would govern federal civil rights enforcement for decades. The federal government investigated systematic discrimination networks in 17 cities using evidence-gathering techniques that had proved effective against organized crime, but the new cases would push federal civil rights enforcement into areas never systematically tackled. Discrimination in employment, segregation in schools, and denial of access to health care affected millions of families across the country. The federal probe showed that systemic racism warranted systemic justice, and that systemic justice was within reach when the federal government committed adequate resources to the protection of civil rights and the coordinated prosecution of organized discrimination. The Preston prosecution had established that Project Rise was not merely a federal investigation, but a permanent transformation in the way America would protect civil rights for centuries. As Nia was leaving the headquarters of the FBI for her new assignment, she reflected on how far she had come from that dreadful morning, when Preston had threatened her daughter, to this moment, when systematic civil rights enforcement was now a federal law enforcement priority. The little girl who had shied away behind her mother's legs was growing up in an America where federal agents ensured systematic oppression faced systematic accountability. You just witnessed resilience that refused to break. If this story deserves to be remembered, help us make sure it is. Subscribe, share, and let's keep these voices echoing for generations to come.